Okay, we're going to be back in Luke 2 working on this Quirinius problem again. Why don't you tell me, someone, what you know about it thus far? Let me make sure that we're on the right track here, because we've kind of woven a web, as it were, around this verse, Luke 2:2, and explaining a lot of things. What's going on? Anyone out there, what's going on right now?
According to Matthew, Jesus was born in the time of Herod and was fleeing from Herod, but according to Luke, he was born in the time of Quirinius.
Which was what time?
Which is 86. No.
How do we know that?
According to many references.
According to extra biblical references then. Of course, it still looks like Luke has him born in Herod's time because of Luke 1:5, right? And he's connecting him to John the Baptist's birth. So that's supposed to be an internal contradiction in Luke. Okay, what else have we said then? That's probably the thrust of everything right now, is we're dating the legateship or the governorship of Quirinius in Syria from AD 6 to AD 9. And having Christ's birth coincide with that is to do damage not only to what Matthew has said, but to what Luke has said earlier, and to what Luke goes on to say later in chapter 3 in saying that Jesus was about 30 years of age. And yet we also know around when the end of his life was, and then you start subtracting 30 or 33 or 33 and a half from that, and you certainly don't get AD 6 or AD 7 or AD 8 or AD 9. You get a BC date there. What else have we said? That was an hour and a half we've looked at this thus far. Surely you remember more than that. Although that was the thrust. What else have we said? Okay, so you're talking about that verse in Luke chapter 2, them appearing in Bethlehem, or in Jerusalem rather, whenever Herod was supposed to be after the child. We've been working on that, and what's the solution to that problem then? That's over in Luke 2, verses 21 and 22. That's, of course, a side issue. That's brought in. I think that was brought up by Ian Sherwin White, and that's why I mentioned it, although I might have mentioned it anyway, because it is an interesting thing to consider and trying to fit all of this chronology together here. Again, trying to reconcile the narratives of Luke with the narratives of Matthew. They just don't seem to be possible, at least not on the surface. And some people have judged that they are not possible, neither on the surface, neither underneath the surface. Would it be possible to reconcile Matthew and Luke's narrative? Of course, if you're reasoning already from the point of view of inspiration and the infallibility of the Word of God and the inerrancy of Scripture, then you kind of are thinking in the back of your mind, okay, we're missing something. It's what we're doing, because Matthew and Luke do agree, so we have to be missing something somewhere. And it's not always possible to know what we're missing. Neither is it always possible to supply in. But the information, sometimes you just have to wait until either A, more things are discovered archaeologically, or B, until the next life and find out whether they were discovered archaeologically or not, that Matthew and Luke are both perfectly correct in what they say. They're writing from a different point of view. One's writing from a Gentile point of view, one's writing from a Jewish to a Jewish point of view and group of people, so we have to have a different strain right away there. Do you remember anything else? What happened? What about Acts chapter 5 and verse 37? That Gamaliel speaks there, and Luke records it, that one Judas of Galilee rose up in the days of the taxing, and it has a definite article there, rose up in the days of the taxing and led a great number of people away from him. Now, one thing we might not have commented about that is, remember, that's not Luke's opinion, that's Luke's recording of what Gamaliel said. Maybe Gamaliel was wrong. You see, there are a lot of instances like that in Scripture, where the Scripture writers record some false, erroneous, atheistic statement made by someone else, some heathen person. Doesn't mean that they believe that the author of Scripture believes that. They're just reporting the facts according to what someone else has said. So that would throw another kink in the story then, that maybe we don't have two of these so-called enrollments or a dual census here, that he was wrong in his view about Judas of Galilee, and really that goes back to BC years. But the evidence that we've looked at in Tacitus Annals 348 and Josephus 18 and 17, books 18 and 17, don't seem to bear that out.
Well, it was the universal census. We start with that, but we didn't deal with the fact that he went to his own hometown.
Ancestral home instead of place of residence.
Or a Roman census.
Okay. And we've got this whole problem here, and I think I mentioned in giving you some of Ramsey's points that it is argued by the critics there was no such thing as any universal census or taxation or enrollment in the Roman Empire. It was all something that was done piecemeal and be done over in this country and then over in this country. It was impossible for Caesar Augustus to send out a decree and say, now, everyone all over the whole empire is going to be taxed. But he'd start with one province and work his way through that and then go on to another one. The way Luke has it, it came to pass in those days there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. Does it seem to be in line with the inscriptions and what we know to be true in Roman history there? Okay.
No records of the census really being taken in 4 BC. 4 BC.
Okay, we're needing something 6 to 4 BC, and we don't seem to have a record of any census back then. We've got one. There's no doubt about the fact we have one beginning in AD 6, or we have, let's just say we have something happening in AD 6. And a big concern of ours is what is, if any exists, the relationship between that and what Gamaliel has either correctly or incorrectly stated over in Acts chapter 5 and verse 37. Sounds like everyone's fairly up to date on this. You'll remember that I've prefaced this study with the remark, this is, and I think I read you a quote from A.N. Sherwin White, this is the most difficult Roman phenomenon in all of the New Testament, the most difficult critical question with which we have to deal. So, we are kind of looking at some solutions and some conclusions to this whole question. You've covered just about everything. There are various other little small points that I mentioned, like the origin of the Zealots. You know, is that connected with the BC, if there was any such thing as BC, or is that connected with the AD? If Gamaliel is correct, and Luke is reporting not only the statement of Gamaliel, but Luke reporting it as though Luke feels it's correct as well in Acts 5 and verse 37, then maybe there we have what's later reflected in the writing of the Gospels as well as the history of the Gospels. The former of those coming, of course, much earlier than the latter of those. The origin for the so-called Zealot movement. And you know that there are Zealots mentioned in the first century, and we may even have something along that line in the New Testament. Okay, I think we ended with looking at just the basic critical claim is that, of course, Luke is wrong. And we haven't said Luke was right yet, but we have said that arguing on the basis of probability, the case would be rather strong, just from the argument of probability, that Luke is not mistaken here because of several things. The events that he gives so precisely in the first 4 verses of chapters 1, 2, and 3, the designation of officials by their correct technical Greek names in the book of Acts, the designation of seafaring and sea travel in Acts chapter 27 and Paul's travel in sea, the correct technical designation of various diseases since he's from a medical background, and then we ended by saying, and he's from a medical background. He was a medical scientist. So it only makes sense that he's going to be very precise in the terminology that he uses, more precise, as A.N. Sherwin White said, trying to date this timeless narrative in Galilee by this various tetrarchies and ethnarchies and legateships and the prefects and the whole reign of Tiberius Caesar, of course, over in chapter 3, although we're back to Augustus Caesar here in Acts chapter 2. That's only from the basis of probability, though. Let's come to another solution or conclusion here, and it was the one that was championed by William Ramsey. It was not initiated by him, but it was the one championed by him in his book entitled, Was Christ Born at Bethlehem? The subtitle runs something like, I'll look it up, A Study of the Credibility of Luke. so you know what the book is all about. William Ramsey. William Ramsey was a classical scholar, New Testament scholar, and archaeologist. The last half of last century and the first quarter of this century, who was probably, in that period of time, the most famous conservative archaeologist that was alive, William Ramsey. He did much on-the-site study in what today is Western Turkey. Of course, that was part of Asia Minor, Western Asia Minor in Paul's time, and doing a lot of look at the cities where the Apostle Paul traveled. Here's a paperback copy of his book. There are many different editions. Was Christ Born at Bethlehem? I'm reading here on the back of the book. Here's some of his other works. I have all of these, and they're very interesting. Now, he's not always right, but here's a almost 300-page book just dealing with this one question of the reliability of Luke in reporting the fact that Jesus was born at Bethlehem and the events that took place after that. For instance, they say about the book Was Christ Born at Bethlehem, the enrollment of Quirinius is discussed, and the accuracy of Luke's gospel is defended. The church in the Roman Empire. Classic study delineates the position of the church in the Roman Empire before AD 170. The cities of Paul offers extensive historical background and traces the influence of these cities on the life and ministry of Paul. Historical commentary on Paul's epistle to the Galatians, and this is probably, it's a very important book that, again, didn't dream up but championed the South Galatian theory for the book of Galatians. You know, that's one of the chief problems with Galatians, the book of Galatians. Was it written to churches in northern Galatia or in southern Galatia? And most conservatives hold that it was a southern Galatian destination for Paul's epistles rather than a northern Galatian destination. That would seem to change the time of the epistle if the latter of those were true. Letters to the 7 churches, historical and archaeological evidence and data relating to the 7 churches of Revelation chapters 2 and 3. Luke the physician and other studies in the history of religion. Affirmed in the first chapter is Luke's accuracy as a historian. Pauline and other studies in early church history, Paul the traveler and the Roman citizen, the teaching of Paul in terms of the present day. So in this book, throughout the book, but particularly as he gets to the last chapter, he champions the idea of a twofold legateship for Quirinius. And as A.N. Sherwin-White says, that is the conservative consensus for today. Quirinius was simply governor or legate of Syria on 2 occasions, one of those being AD 6 to 9. That one being the best known, the best attested in the inscriptions and writings, and therefore the springboard for critical conclusions of Luke's inaccuracy based on Luke 2 and verse 2, because all they're taking into consideration is the second governorship or the second legateship of Quirinius. When was his first one? Well, everybody has a different opinion about this. The NIV Study Bible leans in this direction, although I think it uses the word probably, or perhaps, that Quirinius was governor, and its comment on Luke 2:2. I'm just giving you that since that's what you're studying. That Quirinius was probably governor of Syria on 2 occasions. The first time from 6 to 4 B.C. Now, of course, we know why they'd put it there, because they want that to coincide with the birth of Christ coming a year or 2 prior to Herod's death in 4 B.C. So that would either put it back to 5 or put it back to 6 B.C. then. Ryrie Study Bible, which some of you also have, has maybe 4 to 1 B.C. Others have suggested the first legateship of Quirinius was probably around 8 to 6 B.C. I think I even read one that said it was from 2 BC to around 1 AD. That would get Jesus born in the year 0, of course, which would be what some people would want to have him born in, the year 0. What was the opinion of Ramsey? Ramsey's opinion was that Quirinius was first legate of Syria from 10 to 7 BC. From 10 to 7. Now, in our life study of Publius Sulpicius Quirinius that we gave you way back in the first study of this, we know what he was doing for some of his life, but we have large gaps in our historical understanding of where he was and when he was there. We have a gap between 12 BC and 3 BC. Anything that puts him before 12 or after 3 BC as governor or legate of Syria would probably be incorrect, since we know essentially what he was doing around 12 BC and from 3 BC onwardly up until second decade of the first century, where he finally dies, of course, and Augustus Caesar asked the Senate for a public burial. Well, NIV Study Bible fits in just fine here, 6 to 4 BC. Ryrie is a little too late, 4 to 1 BC. And Ramsey fits in well, 10 to 7 BC, somewhere between 12 and 3 BC. We don't know what he's doing in those years. Is it not possible that he was legate of Syria somewhere during that period of time? That basically is pure and simple guesswork. There is one line of evidence that some people try to use, and I need to mention this. A famous inscription was discovered in the 1750s, stone inscription. Ramsey talks about this. A.N. Sherwin White talks about it. Just about everybody who writes on this extensively or in any length at all will mention this, and particularly conservatives will bring this up. A.N. Sherwin White brings it up. He's really not a conservative. He's not a liberal. He's kind of just a bystander, an onlooker, watching to see what the New Testament has to say and trying to let it speak for itself. And he does a fairly good job at that. But this inscription, discovered in around 1752 or 1754, details the life of an important Roman official. And one statement in the inscription tells us, according to some people's translation of it, how he became, whoever this man is, how he became the legate of Syria for the second time. Who was this man? What was his name? That part of the inscription is missing. That's what we would really need to prove anything about Quirinius. Of course, we're trying to find some proof. Otherwise, you're just saying, well, Luke must have known about something that we don't know about today. And that's okay to say that, but that's pure guesswork is all that is. To say that Quirinius has been governor of Syria, or legate of Syria on 2 occasions, when his life is very, very well known. I mean, we went year by year. It skips over some years. There are gaps. But Tacitus has much information about him. Suetonius has information about him. Luke has a point about him. Josephus has information about him. It's not like we're talking about an obscure, shadowy figure. He's a well-known figure, maybe the most important man in the East as far as the Roman Empire and the Roman provinces are concerned. And so being that important, there would have to be some material existing about him. But the sad thing about the inscription is it's a headless inscription. It's missing the name of the man who became legate of Syria for the second time. Now here's the way some people reason and then argue. They say, well, we know, by the way, around when this dates. It has to come before the time of Tiberius. And we really don't have legates before the time of Augustus. So we're talking about during the time of Augustus Caesar. There's no doubt about that. That's when this inscription, that's what it dates back to, what it's talking about. And what some say is we basically know more or less, again with a few gaps historically speaking, we know more or less who the legates of Syria were. And we don't know of a double reference. We don't know of one man who was legate of Syria twice. You see, if we would know that, if we would know of one man or two men or three men who from other sources could be proven to have been legate of Syria on two occasions, and we just say this stone inscription here is talking about one of those other fellows who we can prove from other places was legate of Syria on two occasions. But since we don't have references to any others, and since this reference in Luke to Quirinius gives us our problem, then it's just assumed that inscription, no doubt, and this is more or less the belief of Ramsey, that inscription no doubt has to be talking about Quirinius. Of course, that's why I said it's pure and simple guesswork that people have come up with that conclusion. However, there may be a lot of fur flying for no reason at all over this inscription, because A.N. Sherwin White, who I would trust in this regard more than Ramsey or more than someone else, tells us that it's not necessary to translate the inscription that way at all in making this man the legate of Syria on two occasions. It could have just spoken about him doing something prior to his legateship in Syria and not having reference to a legateship in Syria prior to his second one. So I'm saying maybe this inscription that now has become famous because it is supposed to answer the problem and the historicity of Luke 2 and verse 2 is really not necessary and really not helpful at all, because maybe it's been mistranslated. Maybe we're not talking about someone who was legate of Syria on two occasions, because that's a little odd to have someone in there on two occasions, particularly when the terms are not consecutive. See, if we've got him way back 10 to 7, then 6 to 9, why something like that? Generally, it's going to be 10 to 7 and then 7 to 4 or something. Why be skipping over all of this period of time? So what I'm saying is the general, the conservative consensus on how to answer the problem of Luke 2:2 may, although it's a consensus and although it's conservative, may be wrong. That seems to be where the evidence points that this view, whether it's the NIV Study Bible or Ryrie or Ramsey or so many other people, that we've got two legateships of Quirinius, that's almost a grasping for straws is what it is. You're trying to have something that will prove that Luke is right after all. Ramsey holds that another man, Saturnius, was appointed legate from 8 to 5. Saturnius. Saturnius. And we know some things about this man as well. Now, if you notice that there's a little overlapping, 10 to 7 for Quirinius, according to Ramsey for the first time, and 8 to 5 for Saturnius, that's only because it would take time to change the government over, and generally you see overlapping years, something like that. And the reason I bring up this man Saturnius is because Tertullian, the North African Latin theologian of the 2nd century A.D., he's writing around A.D. 190, Tertullian, actually has this man, Saturnius, in his text of Luke 2:2, and there's no reference to Quirinius at all. Therefore, obviously you can see this has really attracted the attention of some conservatives, and they have felt that maybe this Saturnius, this variant reading, is the correct reading instead of Cyrenius or Quirinius that we have in Luke 2:2, because Tertullian has that. In other words, Tertullian here in Luke 2:2, his comment on this, and it's more than just a passing comment, would read, this taxing was first made when Saturnius, and that would be from 8 to 5, was governor of Syria, or legate of Syria. And that would fit in just perfectly. Saturnius instead of Quirinius, and that would solve all these problems about Quirinius. Here's what White has to say about Tertullian. He says, a word may be said about the alternative version derived from Tertullian. He substitutes the name of the consular Cincius Saturnius for Quirinius as the legate of Syria, presiding over the census taken at the birth of Christ. There's copious evidence in Josephus to show that Saturnius governed Syria in the years following 6 BC, though he cannot then have been conducting a census in Judea. So he's kind of contradicting the dates for Ramsey. Ramsey just has from 8 to 6, and he said it has to be 6 and sometime later than that. Tertullian is to be taken seriously. He must be repeating a version which aimed already in antiquity at removing the contradiction posed by Luke. How Tertullian or his source acquired this information can only be guessed. There's not a shred of textual evidence for Saturnius being the correct reading here in Luke 2 and verse 2 as opposed to Quirinius. It's only found in the church writer Tertullian. So since there's no textual support, it's utterly impossible for anyone who's honest just to change this because you think this is going to help you out in the long run. There's not a shred of evidence in any of the language translations to have us substitute Saturnius in the place of Quirinius here. So we don't know about Tertullian. As White says, how Tertullian or his source acquired this information can only be guessed. We don't know how he got it, where he got it, but he said evidently he's just reporting or repeating something else where he said already in antiquity it was aimed at removing the contradiction that is proposed here by the gospel writer Luke. Then we have another reference, Justin Martyr, in the 2nd century. In his writings, invited the people who read after him to go and review the register of the first census that was made under Quirinius. And he calls it the first census. He said that the records were still available in his time. Justin Martyr, of course, is writing from Rome. That the register was available in Rome to prove that Luke was correct in what he said, that a first census was taken under Quirinius back in BC years. Now, we've got a different arrangement in the KJV. If you've got your NIV, you might want to compare how the KJV and the NIV differ here. This enrollment was first made when Quirinius was governor of Syria. And the NIV has it turned around and more or less ends up by saying, and this was the first enrollment made when Quirinius was governor of Syria. Now that makes all the difference in the world then, the way the NIV has that. Because if the NIV says this is the first one that was made, not just this was the one that was first made when Quirinius was governor. If it says this is the first one made when Quirinius was governor, that implies the second one then. If it implies the second one, then of course we'd think of Acts chapter 5 and verse 37 as supplying us with the second one, in Luke 2 and verse 2 supplying us with the first one. What about that translation? Well, a translation is certainly possible, and it seems even perhaps to be better than the translation of the KJV, which just gives us, the problem. It sticks us with the problem right away that we wouldn't necessarily have just with Luke 2:2. Now, we'd have problems with other passages here in Luke and trying to correlate those with what Luke 2:2 says, but we wouldn't have necessarily the same problem as implying that we're going to have to find a second one because we have a former of these. So Justin Martyr speaks of a first census done under Quirinius, although I don't think he refers to Quirinius as a governor, as a legate. It's just a first census that was done under Quirinius. Luke is the one who refers to him as governor. There's another solution, another way of getting around the difficulty, and that's to substitute even another translation in here in Luke 2 and verse 2. That is to take this word prote, P-R-O-T-E, to mean prior rather than first. See, the KJV has first, the NIV has first. This enrollment was first made. This was the first enrollment made when Quirinius was governor of Syria. And this is another suggestion of some people's Let's substitute a different translation. So we take out this word first then. Therefore, we don't have a problem of having to find one or two. One or two. Definitely not two, but one or two enrollments or taxings done under Quirinius, because if it says prior, then we'd have something like this census was made prior to when Quirinius was governor of Syria. Now that would really help out a lot, because then that just removes Quirinius from the whole question here of it being based upon him, except to say that he came after the time of the enrollment. If he came in AD 6 and Jesus was born in BC 6, then definitely he came after that time and there'd be no problem at all. So we'd have something like this. This census, or this enrollment, was made prior to. We translate this word proti as prior instead of first. Prior to when Cyrenius or Quirinius was governor of Syria. But there's not a single translation that follows that. Not a single Bible, not a single English translation that follows that, probably because it's an impossibility to translate it that way and to have the sentence arranged in that order. And anyway, it contradicts Luke's practice. He never says something happened before someone else came on the scene. He's always putting the events that are happening right into someone's period of time, like over in chapter 3. He didn't say, now this was a few years before Tiberius Caesar reigned, and a few years before Pontius Pilate was governor, and a few years before Herod was tetrarch of Galilee, and a few years before Philip was tetrarch of Iturea, and a few years before Licinius was tetrarch of Abilene, because that doesn't help us at all. How many years is a few before these guys?
For the continuation.
He didn't say, now this was a few years before Tiberius Caesar reigned, and a few years before Pontius Pilate was governor, and a few years before Herod was tetrarch of Galilee, and a few years before Philip was tetrarch of Iturea, and a few years before Licinius was tetrarch of Abilene, because that doesn't help us at all. How many years is a few before these guys? He's waiting until we get into the period when these men are ruling and saying, now this took place during their rule. Therefore, if you're understanding what I'm saying, Luke 2 and verse 2 would be totally different than what Luke's manner of practice is. He doesn't project something into the future and say, now Quirinius is going to be governor 12 years from now. Let me tell you what took place prior to that. He tells us what's taking place during the reign, the prefectship, the procuratorship, the governorship, the legateship, or whatever of a certain ruler. That solution just does not seem to be a possible solution. Now, before going on, maybe I need to supply some other information here that will kind of help us on our way, but will still put us back in the briar patch on trying to answer this question. Papyri, which has been discovered in Egypt, of course, that's where it's best preserved with the dry climate and the sandy conditions. Papyri from Egypt do indicate very clearly that starting with the time of Augustus, not before, and lasting until the 3rd century A.D., a Roman census was carried out. Listen to this. This will get interesting as we start working with our dates here. In cycles of 14 years. A Roman census was carried out beginning with the reign of Augustus Caesar and continuing all the way up into the 3rd century in cycles of 14 years. Now, you see, all we need now is a little help. Just give us one date, really, is all we need. And start adding and subtracting 14 years, and we'll end up with our dates for these various periods of enrollment. So all we needed was, on that inscription earlier, was a head to it. It was a headless inscription. And White said a headless inscription is dangerous for an ally because it can always change sides at any moment. What we needed there was a name. What we need here is a date. We didn't have a name there. Do we have a date here? Yes, we do. And that's going to be of incredible help and importance. All we need is one date. It can be anywhere in the 1st century, the 2nd century, the 3rd century, and you'll either need my notes or your calculator to start working backwards or forward in history, subtracting or adding 14-year periods as a cycle. We'll find out when these periods of enrollment took place. The earliest dated document of certainty of one of these 14-year cycles. And this is just remarkable. What we're going to end up doing, of course, is proving the accuracy and the reliability of Luke. Not challenging him in any sense of the term, proving how reliable he is. And the archaeological discoveries of papyri and inscriptions have substantiated that. The earliest dated document of certainty of one of these 14-year cycle enrollment periods is from the year AD 34. Okay, start working quickly in your mind. Minus 14 is what? AD 20. Minus 14 is what? 6. We know of that one. Minus 14 is what? 8 BC. We're still running into problems now. Jesus, 8 BC is too early for him to be born. Herod would have tried to kill the children from 4 years and under if we have that much time elapse in Matthew chapter 2 and not 2 years or under. We know Herod dies in 4 BC, and that's really not contested. That's an incontestable truth there, that Herod died in 4 BC. Then that puts Jesus being born back to 5 to 6 BC. 8 BC. Well, according to Ramsey, that's right smack dab in the middle of the first legateship of Quirinius, who was legate for the first time from 10 to 7. Of course, we're saying there's no proof of that at all. There's no proof that any man was a governor of Syria on 2 occasions, not during this period of Syria's history, in this period of Roman history. 34, 20, 6, and 8. Let me give you some other statistics here about this. Tacitus, in his Annals, 111, and Suetonius, in his Augustus, 27. Suetonius in his Augustus 27, as well as Tacitus in Annals 111. One period 11. Tell us that there were 3 periods of enrollment during the reign of Augustus. Tell us that there were 3 periods of enrollment. In other words, we have a census on 3 occasions here. Okay, what's Augustus' years for his rule then? Augustus Caesar, rule from when to when? 31 to what? 14. Okay, which of these would then fit during his life? Not the AD 20, not the AD 34, the one we begin with, not the AD 20. The AD 6 one would have been under Augustus Caesar. The 8 BC one under Augustus Caesar. And what's 8 BC minus 14? 22 BC. 22 BC must have been the first Roman census that was taken then. The first one, period. It was the first one under Augustus, but Augustus was the one who initiated this practice. Augustus is generally referred to as the greatest Roman emperor that ever lived, Augustus Caesar. That's probably incontestable as well. the greatest Roman emperor that ever lived. So he must have begun this process of taking a census in the empire in 22 BC. Then for whatever reason, we don't know the reasons why it was a 14 and not a 22 or a 6-year cycle or every year or every 10 years like we do. Why it was 14, we don't know. But since we know of the 34, you have to put all this together. Since we know of the 34, there was a census going on in 34. And you start subtracting, you get to 20. That's 6 years past the end of Augustus' rule. That's 6 years into Tiberius' rule. That couldn't have been him. You subtract 14 again, you're back to 6 AD. That could have been during his time. And you subtract 14, 8 BC. And since both Tacitus and Suetonius speak of 3 of these periods, a threefold census in 3 different years, 14-year cycles that was done under Augustus Caesar, you have to subtract 14 again. Since you can't add 14 to the AD 6, that gives you 6 years too late, AD 20, and that won't fit during the time of Augustus. You have to go backwards one more time. And you go back to 22 BC, as evidently the first time that a census was taken in the Roman Empire. Now, we still have this problem of a universal census. The way Luke speaks of it here, it came to pass in those days there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. That all the world should be taxed. Now, the critics have said there was no such thing as any universal census taken in the Roman Empire. Well, that may well be true. That there was no universal census in the sense that it was just done everywhere more or less all at the same time. What probably took place is that the census began in, one country somewhere, or maybe in 2 countries, and then piecemeal began to work its way all the way through the Roman Empire. So that what Luke is talking about here, therefore in Luke 2 and verse 1, when he said that a decree from Caesar Augustus went out that all the world should be taxed, he would just mean that this is the beginning. This is the very beginning of this census that will take a little time as it works its way from one country to another country. Now, I think we're going to find out later that it just may work that the critical claim will help us in the long run with them saying there's no such thing as a universal census or universal enrollment or universal period of taxation. You'll see what I mean by that whenever we finish looking at all of this. That just may help us in the long run explaining some of these inconsistencies, chronological ones that continue to exist, even though now we're given a little information about the cycle, the 14-year cycle of these enrollments which were taken. Another point of evidence that we have, another document found in Egypt, speaks of a census. I gave you 34 AD as the earliest one discovered of any certainty. And this speaks of a census done in the year AD 104, which was done in Egypt. Now, you want to start adding 14s to 34? What's 34 and 14? Plus 14. Plus 14. Plus 14. Plus 14. 104. Fits in there just perfectly again. These 2 documents seem to be the best way to prove that this is no haphazard thing. That was maybe every 20 years, and then after they did that for a while, then it went to every 5 years. We've got a document that's certain that dates from AD 34 that said there was a census being taken then. We have a document from 104. It's a multiple of 14. Well, not a multiple of 14, but an addition to 14 if you start with 34. And we're certain that a census is being taken in Egypt at that time as well. That just seems to prove beyond any shadow of a doubt that the census was taken on a 14-year cycle. Therefore, since that's true, there seems to be no way around the fact that the census that was taken in the first decade BC was not taken in AD 6, or BC 6 rather, or BC 5 or BC 4, but in 8 BC, because that's a subtraction from AD 6, from 20, from 34, all the way from 104. That gives us our little bit of a problem, though. There's no doubt about the fact the census was done in 8 BC. The reason I mention this document found in Egypt is twofold. I just gave you the first reason because it just goes to prove the 14-year cycles were consistent. And do you know what else this goes on to prove? According to this document found in Egypt, in a papyri fragment, it speaks of the practice of all people having to return to their ancestral homes and not their place of residence. See, that was one of the critical concerns about Luke, telling us they went back to Bethlehem. The critics say that no one goes to their ancestral home. I mean, in this country, we don't move back to our ancestral home when it's time for the census or something. They count you right wherever you are. And did this really take place in Palestine? We don't have any references to that. Well, now we do. This is a fairly recent discovery of this document in Egypt. It was a census being taken in Egypt, which of course was a Roman province, was part of the Roman Empire at this time. In AD 104, and it gives us our proof, the proof that we need to deal with this critical contention here, that the ancestral home of the individual was the basis for the Roman census and not the place of residence. Now, since this document says that, and that's 104, and since Luke says this, and we're back 8 BC, then there seems to be no doubt we're again to a matter that's incontestable, that ancestral home was the basis of the census and not one's place of residence. Therefore, this, third verse, and all went to be taxed, every one into his own city. That means the city in which he was born. Luke 2 and verse 3, and all went to be taxed, every one into his own city. Therefore, we don't have any problem any longer with this verse. Joseph also went up from Galilee, out of the city of Nazareth unto Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem. And then he adds this little note in here, because he had to get back to his ancestral home. That's what this means. Because he was of the house and lineage of David, he had to return to his ancestral home in order for the census to be effective. To be taxed with Mary, his espoused wife, being great with child. By the way, another problem with this that we don't get into probably in ITP is the fact that males were the only ones who had to return, not females. So why in the world is Mary going back with him? And especially when she's evidently in her last month of pregnancy, why is she making an unnecessary trip down there? Well, that's really not related to the Quirinius problem, but to the Mary traveling out of her way unnecessarily problem that we would have to look at some other time. Which is an interesting thing, to be traveling that late in one's pregnancy and that far. That's a 3-day trip there, and they didn't go by motor coach or airplane or something. Difficult to get down there. She survived it. You know how they are, women getting about the 4th month from the end and, I just can't do any work. I'll die if I try to do something. My wife's not like that. I'm not using her as an example there. Best thing to do is work more. Makes the time pass more quickly the more that you do. And hey, you see, someone says, well, maybe that's the whole suggestion. I mean, we have lots of experience with childbirth here in this church, our family and every family here. What happens when you get to the end? You get anxious. You want the child to hurry up and come. And so what's the best thing to do to solve those problems of anxiety? Keep yourself busy. Keep yourself busy. Isn't that true, women out there? Keep yourself busy so you don't have to think about it. Well, that's what Mary's doing then. And that's a good suggestion. That's a good solution there. She doesn't want to sit at home. A, the baby's going to be born while her husband is gone. And B, what are you going to do just sitting there waiting for that 9th month to finally come? 9th month. I'm going to get on the donkey and we're going to gallop down to Nazareth. Or gallop down to Bethlehem. That's what we're going to do. And that'll give me something to do, and maybe it'll help the labor pains and help the child come. Well, of course, we're not trying to be sacrilegious over the birth of Christ or anything, but I mean, there was a supernatural element to it, but there obviously was a natural element to it. He was a human being that was born of the Virgin Mary. And Mary wasn't God or an angel. She was a human being. So she didn't have to go along here. In other words, the head of the family would go and represent the family. And, you check out there how many dependents you have on the form from Caesar Augustus. How many dependents do you have? You check that out. So he knows you don't have to bring the whole troop along with you. Your extended caravan family or something. Just let the head of the home come and fill out the number of dependents. Well, of course, he only has one dependent at this time, and that's his wife, Mary. But Mary doesn't want to sit at home. See how it's interesting? You can better understand some things in the Bible with some experience yourself. And if you know what it's like in the latter stages of pregnancy, you know what it'd be like to be stuck back home when your husband's getting to take a trip. Even though it's not by airplane or not even by train, it's by walking and by donkey down there. At least he gets to take a trip. And we know Mary to be a pious woman as well. And Bethlehem was one of the holy cities because that was the birthplace of King David. And not only that, you get to go past Jerusalem. And wouldn't any faithful, pious Jew want to visit Jerusalem any time possible? Of course, if she gets down there and happens to have the baby there. Now, we can start really speculating here. Maybe that's what Mary was doing. She was conniving to want to get down there so that she could have the child, so she'd be near Jerusalem the whole time. Because you still got to come down to the Jerusalem if the child was born after they got back up in Nazareth. Well, that's pure speculation, so don't quote me on any of that. But we do have to come up with some solution as to why Mary's traveling down there. I said we weren't going to get into that, and I think we just finished it. She didn't have to go along. There must be some reason why she's going along. And anyway, they're newlyweds, and newlyweds don't like to be separated, so there's another suggestion. Well, we're not too concerned about that right now. We're just concerned about why did they go down to Bethlehem when they could have just stayed in Nazareth. Well, according to our information here, they could not have just stayed in Nazareth. They had to have gone down to Bethlehem in order to be back in their ancestral home. Well, we're not really what I would say out of time, but I think I'll save the rest of this for our next teaching, and we'll end up looking at this, see whether this is really a stalemate that we have to end up with, as A.N. Sherwin-White has said, or if maybe some of the information that we've kind of been developing, weaving this web here, not to catch you, but to help you from being caught and to give you enough statistics to help maybe frame this in your mind, what actually took place and why, and how Luke chapter 2 and verse 2 can be reconciled in light of all the statistics. So over the next few days, you'll be thinking about this and see, I haven't given you all the necessary information, but just about everything necessary, that if you really think about it and really work on it, you can end up with maybe a conclusion. You have to have a few more statistics here, but a conclusion as to what's going on here in Luke 2 and why we really don't have any problem with Luke 2 and verse 2 at all. And while I'm ending this, since I have a few more moments, I'll take the time to mention A.N. Sherwin-White's book. Obviously, you can tell we've used it a lot here in this study. So I want to say several things about the book for those of you interested. It's, again, one of the twin Brooks series from Baker Books. And I think I've said before, just about anything that's part of the twin Brooks series is a classic in Christian writings and worth obtaining. Of course, that's about 40 or 50 or 60 volumes, though, so I don't mean go out and buy all of those. But A.N. Sherwin-White is a Roman historian. He's not a Christian theologian. He's not a Christian historian. He is a Roman historian. He's one of the leading authorities in the world on Roman history. Therefore, for him to write a book dealing with the Roman phenomena of the New Testament, in trying to determine are the conservatives or the liberals right, it would be a very important contribution to the literature that exists in Christianity. And he even starts off saying something about that he's not a theologian, that he's not trained in biblical studies, he's only trained in Roman studies, but he's going to bring his Roman expertise into the New Testament. And look at these terms that Luke uses, these technical terms, and the reigns for these various individuals, these various procurators and prefects. And he discusses that throughout the book to find out now how reliable is this. And of course what he comes up with is that the New Testament is almost 100% reliable. It's reliable. Luke is a valid, accurate, almost inerrant historian. It's entitled Roman Society and Roman Law in the New Testament. It's a technical book with a lot of Greek and Latin terms in it. It's not very big, but it's a classic. And we'll be using a lot of his material. I won't always tell you when I'm quoting from him or something, in dealing with, like this question we've discussed before, which came first, the prefects or the procurators? You see, a whole lot of people say the procurators came first because of a reference in Tacitus to Pontius Pilate being a procurator. But we have an inscription now, discovered in 1961 at Caesarea, that says Pontius Pilate the prefect. And of course what Shore and White, I'm sure, will do, I don't remember this from his book, but I'm sure he will do this. What he'll do is he'll show not only from archaeological discoveries, but just from the way of writing in Tacitus, that Tacitus, since he's looking back in history, is not always correct. And just because he calls Pontius Pilate the procurator doesn't mean the procuratorship antedates the prefectship, but rather the reverse. Roman society and Roman law in the New Testament. Another reason I mention this is the book is out of print. It's been out of print quite some time now, but I know of a place where I can obtain some of these. They do have some stored up. Baker, as a matter of fact, they keep some of their old copies around, and they do have some stored up. If you would like a copy of this, then get your name on a piece of paper again, and I'll order that. It's $7. $7 for the book. I paid $4. That's inflation for you, though. But I've had it a long time and read it several times. And it's nothing that you're going to get any goosebumps over. Unless you get goosebumps over all of this business here with Quirinius. But he is the leading authority on this. And I like it whenever someone who's not a conservative or a liberal, he's just a bystander. Whenever he puts his expertise into looking at these questions. Now, is Luke really right or really wrong here? He says Luke is right in what he says here. And for someone who doesn't have anything to win or to lose, you see, he's not anything to win or to lose, have anything to win or to lose, commenting on whether Luke is an accurate historian in all of this book of Acts and the Gospel of Luke, that says a lot about Luke's reliability as a historian. When someone like this, he's neutral, he doesn't have anything to win or lose, but who passes favorable judgment on the writer Luke.